Good afternoon. I must first say how I ended up here today. I was on a bus trip from Srisailam to Vijayawada for a 6-hour journey, and to keep on the time, I was on Twitter talking to somebody about Nyāya and other traditions. So Swaminiji happened to be on the thread, and she saw, and then she asked me, she posted something on the forum itself about if somebody would come and talk in the session, and then I didn't reply because I am not really trained scholarly way in this tradition, but I told when she contacted me that I am a lay person, but she said that this was enough. I mean, even with a little knowledge it could be done. So that's how I am here today. So thank you Swamiji for this opportunity. So I'll talk about Navya Nyāya, but also Śrīharṣa's contribution to the development of Navya Nyāya. So this whole idea of Sad Darshana, the Darshana idea actually today, because of English, we talk about it in terms of philosophy. But as the word philosophy has come to mean in the West, Darshana is something not exactly equivalent. Because when the Greek tradition started, then philosophy had a meaning of philo of Sophia, which means the love of wisdom. But today, the way philosophy has turned out, it is mostly a construct of the mind, and Western philosophy is very concerned with creating structures of the mind in which it can articulate a mental vision of reality. And sometimes that concomitance of the construction of the mind with the reality outside is not always very exact. So you have systems in the West which are extremely complicated mentally, but they are not exactly relatable to a cognizable view of the universe. And this problem has haunted Western philosophy for a long time now. But darshanas were not intended to be that way. Every darshanakar had only one view. Their view was always to release suffering, human beings of suffering, through their particular view of reality. And all the 6 darshanas have particular ailments that they can alleviate. So it was never that they wanted a creation completely artificial without any link to reality. And there's also deeper reason for this, that in the West, rhetoric and logic were always opposed to each other. They always conceived rhetoric to be the world of content and logic to be the world of form. And right from Aristotle's time, this formalism came into a very strict way into Western logic. So you have formal content in which content is the formal form of the system is very dealing with the content. So you can have completely arbitrary structures which are correct formally but absolutely absurd conceptually. For example, in the West, if you say the grass is green, green is yellow, so grass is yellow, this is all right in a Western form from the point of view of their vision. They would talk about the relevance of yellow and green and grass only later. They would not be so concerned with the fact that are we really talking about some linked content in the world which makes sense? That sense only comes much later in their philosophy. But fundamentally they're concerned with how a logical structure looks like from the point of view of necessitated qualitative linking. And so you can have systems in the West which are completely mental. For example, Bertrand Russell and Alfred Whitehead wrote 2000 pages on proving 2 + 2 = 4. Now this kind of analysis can only happen there when they are very concerned with the logical links of things instead of the content of that logic. So that is why philosophy took a form in which you have systems of Gottlieb Frege, Immanuel Kant, Hegel, and from there on to Whitehead, which are extremely involved in a sense of the logic they have developed. But if you want to seek the solution of that, or you ask them what is the point of this, they won't really have an answer to that, because they are not looking at solving a problem through their logic. They are looking at explaining reality instead of understanding it. And only Hegel has a way in which he says that mundane reason is all right for logic, but for understanding we need a higher logic. But except him, Western logic is completely straight away from this aspect. So darshanas were completely opposite to this view. Whether it be Nyāya, Vaisheshika, Mimamsa, Yoga, Sankhya, or Vedanta, they always wanted to alleviate the problems of lived life to the extent which they could. Now they may differ as to their reach of the system, but they don't differ as to the intention that they want to expound. So in this way, darshanas are not exactly philosophies. And as far as the question of contradiction between systems is concerned, contradiction was essentially a way to question the fundamentals of a system, in a way that every system among the 6 of them are built on particular assumptions which they take it to be granted. And when you have a contradiction in terms, it only means that the assumption system are not actually questioned. So in time, if somebody converts to a system, it means that he has understood the usages of the particular assumptions of his own system, and he's adopted some other assumptive structure. So in a way, it's a ladder in which every converter is kind of traveling. It is not that they are leaving a system and taking another, and in a way the loyalty is being removed. Loyalty is not the question in any conversion. It's always about what assumptions are you going to hold now given what you had earlier. So in a way, all 6 darshanas have a particular inherent linkage to themselves, and if you start from Charvaka and you go up the ladder to Vedanta, you will have traversed all the intentions that come up as part of the evolution of any individual. Every individual in the beginning of search is a materialist, in a sense that he only believes what he perceives. And Charvaka is defined on this assumption, that they don't accept inference as a means of knowledge. So I will only believe what I can perceive. If I can't perceive anything, it is irrelevant for me. With this we begin, and the subsequent positions of the systems all come up with certain understandings of where you lie in your search for the truth. So yoga would take you to the point where you would stand completely independent of the world of form, but yoga doesn't aim at the leash of Vedanta, which is a far higher level. So there is an internal system and a linkage which links these 6 darshanas in their own way. Now we come to the idea of Nyāya. Nyāya happens to be a system that was already in existence before Gautama made his sutras expounded. So in the Mahabharata, it is called Anvikshiki, which is still the word used in all kinds of debate. But Anvikshiki was a term which was most colloquial in nature. But Nyāya gave a kind of formulation and a structure which began the process of thinking in a formalized way about understanding mundane reality. And it was composed around 100 AD, or the range goes back to 100 BC, because Gautama is, some people say he is not actually an individual, he is kind of a representative of tradition before him. So he is kind of giving for the first time in written form certain knowledge which is already existing at the time. For example, even Patanjali is supposed to be somebody who has given out the Yoga Sutras which is already existing before him. He simply codified them. So the Sutrakars were in a way codifiers of an already existing system without the particular codification. So Nyāya's view, the view it wants to defend and the view it wants to expound is that of realism. Now realism is technically defined as the fact that the world as we perceive is independent of our reality. So we don't create it, whether we are there or not, that universe exists independent of us. So this assumes a kind of difference between the subject and the object. That duality is maintained in realism. It is not aiming at a position like idealism, which wants to say that the whole universe is my own creation. So this realism, this idealism battle continues in every tradition of philosophy. The Greeks had it in the Sophists versus Plato and Socrates. In philosophy of Germany, you had Hegel, who was followed up by the British empiricists, who had the same tradition. Idealism versus realism has been a constant battle for all as far as philosophy is concerned. So Nyāya situates itself in the realistic camp. So it wants to understand reality as it perceives independent of itself. So for it, the object is very important, and the subject is linked to the object through the relations he can perceive in himself. So Nyāya is not like Vaisheshika. Vaisheshika is the other side of this, in which it wants to understand the world as it is. So it has nothing to do with how humans perceive the world. It only concerns about the atoms, the structures, the linkages of the universe as it perceives in itself. So it's a more of an ontological position that Vaisheshika has. Nyāya has a kind of epistemological position. So it's concerned with how we know the world. It is not concerned about whether atoms are existing or molecules are existing. That is the Vaisheshika perspective. So these two traditions continued in their own parallel ways until the 9th century, when Udayanacharya had linked them in a system called Nyāya Vaisheshika, which came together to be formed as one instead of two. Since Udayanacharya, it has always been considered as Nyāya Vaisheshika, and the foundations of Nyāya, as it started out with Gautama, changed a lot by the time it came to Udayana. So the example of this is, and the reason Nyāya has come up to change so much is because the original Nyāya Sutras had 16 Padārthas. So Padārthas are fundamental to Nyāya. That is the very system's fundamental heart. So in the original Nyāya Sutra, the 16 Padārthas start off like they are Pramana, Prameya, Samshaya, doubt, and prayojana, the aim, drishtanta, example, siddhanta, the final conclusion, and abhāva is a syllogism, the steps of a syllogism, tarka, which is about the discussion, nirnay, vada and jalpa, vitanda, which is about asking very trivial questions, and hetavāsa, the fallacies, which are now part of rhetorical studies, and chala, which is about tricking somebody into taking an opposite position, or jati, which is sophisticated refutation, and finally nigrahasthana, which is about the final step of defeat. So these are the initial padarthas Nyāya rules out, Nyāya expounds. But by the 9th century AD, when Nyāya and Vaisheshika had collaborated together, only 7 remain, and these are very different from the initial ones. So the 7 last padarthas Nyāya Vaisheshika deals with is Dravya, Guna, Karma, Sāmānya, Visesa, Samavāya, and Abhāva. So these are actually substances. They are not the categories that Nyāya Sutra began with. The link between the two is that what was prameya to Nyāya's formulation became the padarthas of the future Nyāya Vaisheshika system. So all these 7 categories, which are Dravya, which is substance, Guna, the qualities, Karma, which is the actions, so Sāmānya, the universals, Visesa, particulars, Samavāya is inherence, and Abhāva, they all of this, out of them 7, 6 of them already come under prameya in the initial system, but not expounded as such. By the time Nyāya Vaisheshika has maintained itself into a solid structure, only these 7 are considered to be the original ones. And the importance of the fact that darshana is not philosophy comes in the 7th category, which is called Abhāva. Abhāva actually means absence. But for Nyāya, Abhāva is a cognizable reality. We actually can cognize something's absence. For example, if I see a pot now and it is gone after some time, I can actually feel the absence of a pot or cognize the absence of a pot. Now this absence is a very fundamental category to Nyāya, and throughout Nyāya's development and history, absence will make a very big difference as to how Nyāya looks at itself through the other philosophical lens. The great Nyayacharya of the last century, Bimal K. Motilal, his great work in Harvard, which was a PhD thesis of that time, was about the Navya theory of negation, and that began the entire system of negation studies in English, because before him English philosophy did not know about Navya. It was the work of J.N. Mohanty, Bimal K. Motilal, or Shivaji Bhattacharya, who this generation of scholars introduced Nyāya to the West. Now the price they had to pay was that in order to appeal to the West sense of analytical philosophy, Navya had to also cloak itself in that lens. So many a time this darshan aspect was lost in the translations of English, Sanskrit text to English. So you are left with the understanding of Navya as purely analytical, and it wants to compete with the view of Western logicians like Frege or Russell. And in that view, sometimes the darshana or the open-ended aspect of Nyāya is kind of not given the emphasis it actually deserves. Now, Nyāya has changed a lot since it began with Gautama. So the initial Nyāya Sutra, it deals with prameya much more than with the pramana. So a lot of the talk of Vatsayan Sutras, Vatsayan's Bhashya on the Nyāya Sutra and Udyotakara up to Udayana is concerned with understanding soul, mind, emotions and all these objects. But by the time you come to 13th century, 14th century, the very tone of Nyāya has changed. So from Gangesha's creation, it all focuses upon how we prove what we can know. So the focus has been on pramana now. So from prameya to pramana is a journey of Nyāya to Navya. And pramana became the focus primarily because Buddhists came and attacked Nyāya logicians about their methods of proof. So proof was not the main focus of Nyāya to begin with. It was because of philosophers like Dignag and Dharmakirti who began the entire tradition of looking at proof in more detail than ever before. And it was Dignag's creation of syllogism in 3 steps which led to the creation of the 5-step Nyāya syllogism. And also inference, and I will come to that later. It was the work of Buddhist logicians which led to Nyāya reformulating itself as Navya in a way, through the work of subsequent generations of scholars. So the fact that cognition now, so the fact that pramana has become the more important part, it means that it has to focus much more now about how it is convinced that what it perceives, what it infers is actually there or not there. And this excessive focus can sometimes appear to be a bit of a hair-splitting logic, but I'll come to why it becomes to be that way. So among the 7 padarthas that I talked about, which are Dravya, Guna, Karma, Sāmānya, Visesa, Samavāya and Abhāva, the glue of the system, the 7 of them are linked through the property of Samavāya, which is the inherence. And inherence happens to be the fundamental focus of all Navya Nyāya work, right from Gautama till Udyotakara and continuing till Gangesha, Raghunatha and ending with Gadadhara Bhattacharya. So I should talk about inherence a bit more. So inherence fundamentally comes to be what we call the ontological glue of a system. For example, if I say a pot is blue, logicians look at pot and a blue as 2 different things. For them, blueness and potness are distinguishable properties. And then somebody can ask, then how is the blueness linked to the potness? So logicians will say the blueness is inhering in the potness. So there is some kind of a pervading relationship in which one layer of reality links itself to another layer of reality. So the Dravya, the pot, is pervaded by the blueness. And this pervasion is the English word which is trying to approximate the word of Samavāya, but there is still a difference. So inherence is essentially the way in which every property, the ontology of the universe is kind of layered onto each other. So qualities like blueness can inhere in properties, inherent in substances. Universals like, for example, if you say Lakshmi, a cow named Lakshmi, you say Lakshmi is a cow. Now you have to say that how do we know that this is a cow? You say cowhood is the way you know it's a cow. So they will go to universals directly. And universals in Nyāya are almost like living realities. They look at universals as a particular view of reality where they are existing independently. They just simply happen to be on substances. So cognizability or understandability is always through universals, not through particulars. So Visesa, the particular thing you see, is almost kind of an irrelevant thing to Nyāya. It is concerned about the universal aspect of what it is that makes me distinguish between a pot and a cloth, for example. They will say potness and clothness are different things. And it is through the ness of things that we understand the differences. So this will give to problems which we will come to later. So inherence, as I said, was the fundamental glue of the Nyāya system. So they distinguish between these 7 substances as to who inheres in what. So you can create a layered reality in which from the top to bottom you come to universal to particular. And this is what they explain to be as to why the 7 became finally solid. They didn't have to go beyond 7 because 7 was enough for their whole system. Now we come to the understanding of cognition. So all these prameyas, all these padarthas that Nyāya is talking about, it has to understand all of this in exactness. It has to understand, am I cognized, is what I see a perception or inference? For example, the difference is I can see fire and say, I can see a fire is perception for me. I can see smoke and say there is fire because I can see the smoke. The first one is a pratyaksha, which is perception. Second one is the inference. So Nyāya will deal with this in a lot of detail as to what distinguishes the 2 things. One is it an inference, one is it a perception. So the important thing is that Nyāya recognizes only 4 methods of proper proof. And those 4 are pratyaksha, anumana, and what it will call the analogy aspect, or by testimony, hearing somebody talking about somebody. Now Nyāya has 4, the Jaina systems have 10. There are systems in parts of Jaina which has 14 proof mechanisms. So Nyāya is linked to only 4. And even among these 4, it concerns pratyaksha as the primary means of knowing about reality. So pratyaksha is the jyeshta pramana, they say. Inference sometimes can also be said based on perception. So perception, that's why occupies around 2/3 of Nyāya exegesis and deliberation in all the great works. Like Gangesha Tattva-Chintamani has half the book on perception only, which has been finally translated in English after around 15 years of collaboration between an American academic and a scholar in Tirupati. So it took a lot of work to come down to understanding Tattva-Chintamani's chapter on perception. The important thing, the next important thing is the role of tarka in Nyāya. So tarka is actually not part of the main proofing technique. Nyāya does not consider tarka to be very important as part of a convincing proof. So tarka comes under what is called aprama, which means doubtable reasoning. So the important thing is, why is tarka then so important? If tarka is not convincing in its final state, why is tarka so important? Tarka happens to be important only because tarka is considered to be an intermediate step by which you can clear doubts. And tarka actually has a technical definition in Nyāya. It is not just about what is called in the West reductio ad absurdum. Like you take on somebody's position and take the logic and come to absurdity. And you say your whole system is flawed because the conclusion is flawed. This is the way sometimes logic is understood as to be completely about self-defeating. But for Nyāya, Tarka has a very technical meaning, which means that, I'll read it out in the way that Nyāyacharyas say. So Tarka is the ascription of the pervader by the ascription of the pervaded. These are terms of technicality. What it means is that I'm ascribing a certain pervader, for example, fire, which is pervaded. The pervader is the fire and the pervaded is the smoke. Now, Tarka's fundamental role is to remove doubts. It has no other role. So suppose I ask, is there fire? To remove this doubt, Tarka will say, if there is no fire, then there is no smoke. And it is this no fire, no smoke that I am cognizing. So in the end of this, so you begin with the assumption that you say a counterfactual. So suppose you say if there is fire, you say if there is no fire. So the opposition is always raised first. If there is no fire, there is no smoke. But there is smoke, so there is fire. So you always go from a position A to the opposition of that and then take a conclusion and then arrive at what you can cognize. So if the doubt is raised, for example, you have any doubt about is x equal to f? The Tarka will go like this. If x is not f, then x is not g. But I can perceive that g exists. So my perception of the conclusion of that reasoning process convinces me of the initial presupposition of the problem. So by the end of Tarka, I am only convinced about my initial question. So if I ask a question about x equal to f, by the end of Tarka, I will be convinced, yes, x is equal to f, because if x was not equal to f, there would be no g. But because I can see g, I am convinced that x is equal to f. So this is simply a basic definition. Tarka goes into a lot of detail, and generations of Nyāya scholars have made their whole reputation based on how good of a Tarka exponent they were. So you in the Calcutta University up till late, there were titles like Tarka Vagisha, Tarka Alankara, Tarka Tirtha, and many of the books also have the same titles, which meant that Tarka was a very important part of the Nyāya project for many centuries. But Tarka still remains as a aprama, so it is not taken to be the final definition of any methods of proof. You have to use Tarka only to arrive at a particular position, and then you can go on from there. But your Nyāya is very concerned ultimately with pramanas only. Tarka happens to be the linking between the doubt and the pramana. Okay, so now I'll go to the more important part of inherence. The problem of inherence as defined in the initial Nyāya works was about, so if potness and blueness are linked through inherence, the first problem that was raised was, then what is inherence's status? Is it a kind of a relationship term, like two terms? So if you have pot as a term, blue as a term, is inherence a term? Now initially it was defined as a relation, as a term, which is, it makes three terms. So you have pot, potness and inherence. The problem with this formulation was, the first one to raise objection was of course Nagarjuna in his Mula Madhyamika Karika, that if inherence is a term like the other two terms, what links inherence with other terms? So whenever you have two terms and a third term comes in, there are terms created which require more terms to connect them. So like this they would call what is called the relation regress. So you have two terms, pot and potness. You have a third term called inherence to link the two. Now you have inherence and potness, link them to another term and keep on linking like this until you go on to infinity. So inherence becomes a problem for at least 7-8 centuries, because inherence always happens to be the one hammer with which every idealist actually used to beat up the Nyāyikas in many debates. And by the end of 10th century, 11th century, inherence came to be understood very differently from what it was. But this objection to inherence's fundamental status, whether it's a relation or a term, carried on in many books. And Udyotakara in the 8th century has almost 150 pages to discuss the objections that are raised about inherence. Okay, and this problem of relations is not something unique to just Nyāya and Vedanta or Nagarjuna. In the 20th century, a philosopher of Britain called Francis Bradley, he was almost echoing the same problem in this century, last century, which was articulated by Nagarjuna in the 2nd century BC. So this relation regress has been a problem of metaphysics for a long time. It was only in the 14th century that Nyāya could completely reformulate itself and answer this question. So it is almost a long-standing problem for Nyāyikas. Now the question of pramanas. So pramanas are defined very clearly. So there's a concept in English as they call veridicality. Veridicality is essentially the very heart of the Nyāya system. It means that veridical perception, veridical inference, veridical analogy, veridical testimony, they all depend on the understanding of veridicality to the extent that it is defined as, is my awareness in my mind linked to or equal to what is conceived outside of me, independent of me. So suppose I am looking at, for example, the classic example is fire on a hill. Suppose I see there is smoke on the hill and I conclude there is fire. Now it will be a veridical perception if in my mind what I am cognizing actually is what is out there. So veridicality depends on what is called certitude. What is the proof that what I think about reality is actually true, independent of me? If somebody could go and verify it, then I can be said to have veridical perception. Now, veridicality is not the same as pramana, because there is something which can happen even without being so consciously sure of things. For example, there are people who can cognize or infer certain things without knowing exactly why they are cognizing it. Some part of them can almost know it instinctively, and they may not be consciously aware of the thing which actually is true. So consciously knowing the process of justification is not necessary to Nyāya to an extent. Nyāya has a room for layman's understanding of the world. It is not hell-bent on imposing a certain cognizable reality and justification in reality on every of its perceivers. So there is a certain thing called accidental veridicality, that without even knowing the actual process, you can be sure of your conclusion, not that you have actually gone and verified it according to pramanas, but you have the prama, which is a true cognition. You can't have a prama without being the pramanas. Pramana is more of a conscious approach of actually cognizing every aspect of the process of justification. So in a pramana, I have to be very consciously sure that I can actually see the fire, I can cognize the fire because I can see the smoke. I have to know it consciously. But suppose growing up, I am used to just linking smoke and fire without doing pramanas and all the Nyāya theories. For Nyāya, it is enough that you have veridical perceptions without actually having gone through the Nyāya process of knowing things. So this much room, so you can see what Nyāya actually wants to understand. Nyāya is not concerned with ontological layerings of reality. It is concerned with how to explain reality as we see it. And this focus of Nyāya will remain for as long as it is trying to defend itself. So the first problem that was raised aside from inference was that Nagarjuna raised this question that I take the justification is required for my perceptions and inference. But how do I justify the justifiers? This was called justification regress in philosophical literature. It was asked that how do I justify the justifiers themselves? That if I see something, I may perceive something. What is it that convinces me that what I am perceiving is true in the process of perceiving it? In the sense that, how do I know that the fire that I see or the smoke that I cognize is actually real? Now that question Nyāya will not ask, because for the Nyāya it is important that you see smoke and you convince that fire is there. Nyāya won't question that is smoke real. For Nyāya, reality ends with my cognizing what I see independent of me. But every idealist ultimately comes to the conclusion that what I see cannot be taken as real itself. And this is the one problem which Nagarjuna to Śrīharṣa will raise repeatedly against Nyāya, that we don't accept your pramanas to be justifiable enough, because we question the very root of the pramanas themselves. We question that how can you take smoke to be smoke? It can simply be an illusion of yours. And this objection that Nyāya faced from idealist philosophers was not resolved in its entirety even till this day, because Nyāya is not looking to justify how idealists look at the world. Nyāya is defending its own version of reality. So every solution to the objection ultimately revolves around this defense of realism. And that's why this kind of objection was almost in a way taken to be outside the system's parameters itself. So this is important to Nyāya, that realism has to be defended at any cost. And Śrīharṣa then comes into the question, because Śrīharṣa essentially was somebody who had internalized every objection raised about Nyāya for the last 5-6 centuries. So when Śrīharṣa wrote his Khandana Khadya, he was talking about objections that were prior to him existing since Nagarjuna. So he can be considered to be the final objector to Nyāya's positions, who in a way through his book gave the kind of objections which wouldn't have been there if Śrīharṣa hadn't written them down. So Nagarjuna, Dignag, Dharmakirti and every Buddhist philosophers, including Abhidharma philosophers, they raised objections of their own kind, and Śrīharṣa collected all of them and gave it one formulation on his own book. So Śrīharṣa happens to be the final, in that time, the final nail in the coffin for Nyaya's metaphysics. And it took Gangesha 1 century after that to finally resolve this problem of objections to Nyāya, which took the form of Navya Nyāya. So we'll come to what Śrīharṣa actually raised and objections to Nyāya. So Śrīharṣa was an Advaitin, so clearly he's somebody who has realized the Brahman. So when he talks about the objections, you can see his perspective is very much to do with the realization of what he sees. So when he raises the question as to justifiability, he says that I don't accept justifications of Nyāya because I believe only self can self-justify. For him, the self-realization is the only final mark of justification. What is called Swata Pramana. I don't need anything beyond me to prove anything about the truth. I can cognize reality on my own self. Of course, the self is the highest self that is cognizing. So Swata Pramana is the final objection of Śrīharṣa to all problems of Nyāya. The certification itself is a flawed process, because if I don't need certification beyond me, then how can you convince me that I need to be careful about perception, inference, analogy, or testimony? Because I am finally the own proof. I am the certifier. I don't need certification beyond me. And this view that the object and what is called the sublatability argument in Vedanta. So Śrīharṣa asks the question that Nyāya considers realism to be defined as something independent of me. What is outside of me is real. But Śrīharṣa questions this very thing, that what is real is what is not sublatable. And sublatable essentially has a meaning in technicality. Sublatability means negability. So if I can negate something, if I can look at myself as something separate from a reality, that is not real at all. So he will keep on negating all reality versions until he comes to a point where he cannot negate anymore, and he says that is only real. So anything non-sublatable is only real, which is the very opposite of Nyāya. And Nyāya thinks that whatever I can perceive is real, Advaitins will negate that and say that is not real. So in a way they are very much opposed to each other. And in the end, the objection of the Śrīharṣa has to Nyāya is that your objects that you are talking about in realistic terms, as the table or the chair or the pot or the flower, when I certify myself through self-certification, through self-consciousness, the highest self, there is no object left. So all objects have been subsumed in the vision of the self. So there is no object that is left to be revealed or to be justified in the vision of Śrīharṣa, which is the realization of all the Vedantic perspective. So in a way, Śrīharṣa dismantles the very Nyāya project of giving a certain realism to everyday objects. And in this version, he echoes a very old problem of self-realizations, including Nagarjuna, who in a way can be interpreted to be somebody who talks about the same thing in a different format. For example, the entirety of Mula Madhyamika Karika in the commentary of Tsongkhapa and following from Nagarjuna is about dismantling the object. For example, Nagarjuna's arguments follow a particular pattern in which he says that fire and fuel don't exist independent of each other. And he will take every set of two objects and dismantle their independent reality. So he will say there is nothing in the universe which exists on itself. Abhāva, he says, doesn't exist with any object in the universe. In a different way, and Śrīharṣa has the same objection, that there is nothing that is even cognizable in a material form in self-certification. So the views from which and the schools they come from fundamentally define their objections to each other. So Śrīharṣa comes from a point of view where there is no object at all. There is only the subject, and the self is the ultimate subject in which the object is almost inherent in. He has come up somehow forgotten himself in the subject. So these objections were raised by Śrīharṣa in Khandana Khadya in various forms. So the whole Khandana Khadya is a set of attacks, and at a time when it was released, it was called Vitanda, as in Nyayikas used to think that these are very petty objections, until it took people who commented, Nyayikas commented on Khandana Khadya to say that these things require attention. They cannot be ignored simply because they look as if in a forceful tone. Śrīharṣa's book, of course, is full of more than logic. It is a very great book of even the formation of the languages. It's full of wit and humor, a lot of sarcasm also for its time. The other objection that he raised, and this problem links Śrīharṣa with somebody much more removed from him in time in Western philosophy, is that Śrīharṣa asked, what is it that you're cognizing through your pramanas? So for example, I say, I can cognize smoke, I can infer fire. For Śrīharṣa, this only means that in your awareness, you can say something about smoke, something about fire, which are nama rupa for you. You can just say the name and the form of the thing. Śrīharṣa asks, what is it you've actually cognized? Except the name and the form, what is it are you convinced of? Or he says in technical language, what's the tattva of the thing that you've cognized? What tattva have you actually entered within yourself? Now, because Nyāya separates itself from the subject and the object, it can only talk about the object's representation in the subject's mind. It can't talk about what the object is in itself. For example, it can't talk about how is it to be a fire, how is it to be a bat, how is it to be a cow. It has no access to that level of reality. For Nyāya, always I am separate from my subject, of my object, so I can talk about what is inside my consciousness. And the linking that I'm talking about, all the justifications, all the pramanas, are all about proving to myself that what I see is actually there. But it has no concern with the actual reality of the thing in itself. And this term, thing in itself, was raised again 4 centuries after Śrīharṣa by Immanuel Kant, whose whole work fundamentally comes down to not being able to know thing in itself. So in a way, the Nyāya problem continues even in Western philosophy, that no matter what you can know about the world from your limited viewpoint of an embodied human being, you can only know about the name and the form of what you can cognize with your senses. What your subject is in itself, you can never know. And this is a limitation of the mind itself. And Nyāya very much takes it to be granted that this is the limit of Nyāya's metaphysics also. It won't go beyond this to defend any other position. So, okay. So now after this tattva thing was raised, then it was kind of the objection which couldn't be removed at a point, because Nyāya would not find any point to go into the thing in itself. It has already defined its position. We are linked to the subject-object duality. So Śrīharṣa also has questions about the relation regress, which is about the two terms. He says that if there is a property and property bearer, for example, if there is a pot and there is a blue color of the pot. He says there are three things. Either the pot and the color are unlinked, or a third term links them, or there is no way of knowing whether the pot and the color is different. Now these three positions are almost three different schools. The first position, that the potter and the pot are different, necessitates a third term, which is the original relation regress. But the third objection, that if you say, so Nayikas used to say that when the objection was raised, that actually relation is almost self-linking to the potness or the blueness. So it isn't a third term, it's kind of a hybrid term which kind of moves here and moves there. So it seemed kind of just a way to get out of the problem for Nyayikas. Then Śrīharṣa raises the question that if you can't separate the blueness and the potness, maybe you cannot actually talk about reality in such distinct terms. And this term came to be known as anirvachaniya for Śrīharṣa. That the final comment he made about Nyāya is that you can't talk about mundane reality in any distinguishable form. The reality as we cognize it outside of ourselves cannot be described in any proper way. We have to leave it as something that is anirvachaniya. We can't talk about it. We have to, in a way, Buddhism has the same perspective, what is called dependent origination. That we can only talk about reality as a set of moving forms which somehow happen. But we can't give it a very structural outlook through a logical structure or metaphysical structure and say that this system how it runs. Buddhism and Vedanta very much agree on this, that mundane reality cannot be talked about with any decent intellectual structure. It has to be left at a semi-level of simply cognition. And anirvachaniyata happens to be a very long-standing objection to Vedantins, to all Nyayika philosophers. Okay, so next thing is that, next objection was raised about universal. So I talked about the pot and the blue. So for Nyayikas, potness is different from pot. And if you ask a Nyayika, how is it that you know that table is different from a chair? The Nyayika will say that table is tableness and the chair is chairness. We know that the chair is different from the table because the chairness is different from the tableness. And they always look at differences at a universal level, not at the particular level. Particulars are almost a kind of simply passive subjects waiting to be inhered by some universal. But knowledge comes from universals, never from the particulars. So then Śrīharṣa raised the question as to, okay, if it is the case that only universals define particulars, how do we know that the tableness is different from the chairness? Because you have not given definitions to how they are different. You have said that they are different in the universal planes, but how are they different? You haven't described it. So this was called the universal regress. So he says that if there is a distinction to know between tableness or chairness in the universals, then can you say that anything can be known with any distinctness ever? So distinctness is also one of the main objections of Śrīharṣa to Nyāyas, that unless you can give me a proper way to distinguish between universals, you can't be sure about how to define particulars. So he also raised the objection as to universals continuing in an infinite regress up to going to a point where all things become indistinguishable. And in the same way, anirvachaniyata becomes the same problem in the universal plane. Now, it took Gangesha and people, Manikanta Mishra, and at least 200 years of Nyāya scholars to come up with answers to these objections, which were raised for at least 5-6 centuries. So Gangesha's Tattva-Chintamani is the solution to all these problems, and Tattva-Chintamani is one of the great works of philosophy in Eastern or Western, because it deals with problems at a very abstract level only because these objections had to be answered once and for all. And till now only the first part has been translated in English, the rest of that they remain untranslated. But I'll talk about what Gangesha's fundamental solutions were. So the first problem that Gangesha had to answer was that how do we know that the potness and the blueness are not linked by a third term, which is inherence. So he came up with the concept of indeterminate cognition, in which the inherence is actually not something that you cognize as a separate term, but is something that is indeterminately known by you while you are perceiving something. So he will say that the potness and the blueness are linked by inherence, all right, but inherence isn't a separate term. It is something that is already as a part of the blueness. So he will not link it to the qualifier, as they say. The qualifier is the blueness, and the qualified is the pot. He will say that the qualifier already has a self-linkage with inherence. So I am not actually treating a separate term, and thus this whole infinite relation regress and justification regress, these problems were solved by removing a term and converting it into some kind of a property which inheres in the qualifiers already. So this solution of indeterminate cognition stops the problem from being taken beyond it to an infinite level of objections. And relation regress was important because Nyāyikas could finally answer the people who came up with objections like Advaitins and Buddhists. This came to be known as Vyapti. Vyapti was a term that was used only with Tattva-Chintamani, in which self-linkage or the inherence thing linking itself with the qualifier was defined in a very detailed way in Tattva-Chintamani. And he made it clear that Samavāya, the inherence thing, is not a relata. Relata basically means the terms want to be related. So blueness and potness are relata, and they have to be linked through Samavāya. But Samavāya is not a relata at all. Samavāya is something that links itself with the qualifiers or the qualified. And he says that qualifiers are directly known. They are not known by a cognition. So in Nyāya it is important to have verbalizable objections, verbalizable concepts. So if I say that pot is blue, this is already a higher layer of cognition. Before this, I already cognize it in a very subliminal form, which takes the shape of articulatable reality. So Navya Nyāya distinguishes between these two layers very well. It says that sometimes most human beings, they don't have articulable view of reality. They have already a working view which is very subliminal in nature, and it's a higher level of cognition which links as to how you articulate it. So before you come to determinable things, articulable things, you have to go through a process of indeterminate cognition, and this understanding, and this is true even biologically and even psychically, that before Gangesha there was no talk of indeterminate perception in any philosophical literature. It was Gangesha who brought in this perception and then answered the people who were talking about relation regress for at least 1 millennium. Then you come to know of, so the example of self-linkage is this. The best example is Abhāva. So the way Gangesha perceived Abhāva was that when you see a pot is not there, it is not that the pot is actually linking itself through a way with the floor. Suppose a pot is on the floor and you don't see it after some time. So absence is something that you don't actually cognize in a way you cognize, for example, a chair. Absence is cognized by a link of inherence even there. But what is the inherence about? It's the inherence of absence. So this formulation is of course very complex. So as a means of understanding it, so if Nyāya wants to understand how is it that the pot is not on the floor, makes sense logically for Navya Nyāya. 5 minutes more. Then he will say that I will link, for Navya, it is important to formulate in terms of A or B. So A is the qualifier, R is the relationship, and B is the qualifier. He will say that it is actually absence, inherence of absence linking itself to the floor. So this formulation of extremely complex technical terms to understand something which is ordinarily very easily understandable, but Nyāya has to go into a lot of detail because it has to explain that how is it that the relationship between the floor and the absence of a pot is actually logically consistent and clear. And it is because of this kind of problems that sometimes Navya can appear extremely obsessive about relationships which don't come in daily life. So in substance, Navya is an artificial language that has been created. It is not a language for daily talk. It can only be used for scholars or people who are deliberating on things at a very abstract level. But Navya was never meant to be answerable to the layman. And it is in this feature that Navya has reached extreme heights of abstraction. The greatness of it is that it has made assumptions of daily reality very clear. It is so clear that even to understand things like the color is brown, you have to go to 50 pages of analysis on this. So it makes sense to somebody who is understanding mundane reality in its complete exactness, but it is not meant to understand the higher reality, because Navya wants to perfect its mundane reality's understanding. And because it believes that even in mundane reality there is a right and a wrong. If right and wrong are congruous only in terms of self and not self, that's a high bar for the layman. For the layman, he has to work in the mundane reality and he has to be clear about right and wrong even at this realm of reality. And in this realm, Navya has reached his perfection. So in my next talk, if I get a chance, I'll talk about technicalities, but here I think I should stop and end it here.